The Nevada highway unrolled in front of him like a sentence that had no end. Black asphalt bleeding into white sky. The kind of afternoon that made men honest about what they were carrying, and Reed Calloway was carrying more than most. He reached down without thinking. 3 taps against the carbon fiber where his left knee used to be. Tap, tap, tap. The ritual had no name. He had never given it one. Names made things real, and some things you kept formless for as long as you could. Ghost sat behind him in the custom sidecar Reed had built 11 years ago from a frame he found in a junkyard outside Reno. The dog didn't fidget, didn't whine, just watched the road come at them with the patience of something very old and very certain. German Shepherd retired military working dog nose that could find C4 through 3 feet of packed earth. Ghost had earned his retirement, more than Reed had. 2 dog tags hung from the rear view mirror on a strip of leather. Both worn smooth, both silver. One read Sergeant R. Calloway, USMC. The other read Staff Sergeant J. Strand, USMC. The second one had no business being there. It should have been in the ground at Arlington with Joe. But Evelyn had pressed it into Reed's hand at the graveside on a gray Virginia morning 20 years ago, her fingers so cold he'd wondered if she'd already started to die herself. He'd want you to carry it, she'd said. He'd want you to keep moving. So Reed had kept moving. 20 years of it. 20 years of desert highways and dead-end towns, and the quiet company of a dog that understood more than most men Reed had known. 20 years of tap, tap, tap against a leg that stopped at the knee and kept going on titanium and carbon fiber and something harder than either. The sign appeared through the shimmer of heat. Crestfall, Nevada. Population 2,800. Reed let the Harley coast. Ghost shifted his weight, a subtle adjustment that meant the dog was paying attention. Animals always knew first. They read the invisible things, the pressure changes before a storm, the difference between a man who was sane and a man who was dangerous. Reed trusted Ghost Reed on a place more than his own. The letter had come 3 weeks ago, handwritten on cream-colored stationery, the script careful and slow, the hand of a woman in her 80s who still believed that certain things deserve paper and ink. Reed, I know I have no right to ask this of you. You've already given more than any man should have to. But there are things about Joe's death that I have never told anyone. Things that have been living inside me for 20 years. My son Owen started asking questions last year. He's gone now. Brake failure on Highway 93, they said. Owen maintained his own vehicles. He would never have let his brakes go. I am 81 years old and I am not afraid of dying. But I am afraid of dying before someone knows the truth. Please come. Evelyn. 3 sentences had kept Reed awake for 3 weeks. Owen started asking questions. He's gone now. Brake failure. Brake lines didn't just fail. Reed had gassed up the Harley in his garage and Flagstaff loaded Ghost into the sidecar, pointed the bike north. 300 miles of thinking time. 300 miles of remembering Joe Strand, who had been the best EOD tech Reed had ever worked with, who had a laugh like a thunderstorm and a mind like a surgical instrument, who had pushed Reed out of the way of a fireball in a Fallujah alley on a morning in March and absorbed the blast that should have written Reed's name in the ground. Joe died. Reed lived, minus 1 leg and plus a lifetime of wondering what that meant. The Iron Brotherhood patch on his jacket caught the afternoon sun, a motorcycle wheel wrapped in chain. 22 years of brotherhood. He'd called Luther Kane last night from a truck stop outside Winnemucca. Something's not right in Crestfall, he had said. Need eyes. Luther had not asked for more. He never did. We'll be there, he'd said. Name the time. That was the thing about men who'd been in bad places together. You didn't need paragraphs. You needed 1 sentence and a direction. Crestfall appeared below the highway like something that had given up. A cluster of buildings in a valley ringed by brown hills. A water tower painted with a sun that had faded to a smear. A gas station, a church, a grain elevator that hadn't moved grain in a decade. Main Street ran straight through the middle of it like a scar that had healed wrong. Reed guided the Harley down off the ramp. Ghost's ears came forward. He found the diner on the corner of Main and Second. Rosalie's, the sign said in red neon cursive, half the letters burned out. The parking lot was gravel and the building was low and wide and had probably looked exactly the same in 1962. He killed the engine. The desert silence came back. Ghost hopped out of the sidecar with the ease of practice. The dog shook himself once, nose working, the air, reading the invisible text of everything that had moved through this parking lot in the last 12 hours. Then he sat at Reed's left heel. Ready. Always ready. Reed swung his right leg over the saddle, set it down, then carefully pivoted the prosthetic into position. The balance was a matter of muscle memory, now the same muscle memory that kept him from reaching for things on his left side without thinking. You learned your new geometry or you fell down. Reed had not fallen down in 17 years. He rolled his neck, felt the familiar pop at the base of his skull, and pushed through the diner's glass door. Cool air and the smell of coffee and bacon grease. Booths along the windows, a counter with red stools, a pie case holding 3 options that had not changed since this place opened. The lunch crowd had thinned to a scatter. A table of construction workers in the back, a couple by the window with a baby in a carrier, a pair of truckers at the counter reading their phones. Normal people living normal lives in a normal town. Behind the counter, a young woman with dark red hair, pulled into a ponytail, was refilling a coffee cup. She moved efficiently, professionally, the practiced motion of someone who'd been doing this long enough to stop thinking about it. Her name tag said Nora. She was 22, maybe 23. She had the kind of face that was meant to be open and wasn't. Something was being held back in it, something careful and watchful behind the professional smile. Reed noticed the bruise before he noticed anything else about her. Left forearm, fading to yellow-green. 4 days old, maybe 5. 4 distinct marks where fingers had closed around the bone. Someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave a signature. Ghost noticed too. The dog's head came up. His nostrils flared once, reading something Reed couldn't. Reed took a stool at the counter. Ghost settled at his feet, invisible in the way working dogs learn to be. The woman Nora came to him with the coffee pot. She smiled, the professional one, not the real one. "Just get in, passing through," Reed said. He watched her hands. They were steady. Whatever she was carrying, she'd gotten good at not showing it. Just coffee. "Coming right up." She poured without spilling a drop, set the cup in front of him without looking up. Reed's eyes tracked the room out of habit. He had not stopped doing that in 40 years. Entrances and exits, positions and angles, who was watching who? It was the tax the Marine Corps had levied on him at 19, and he'd been paying it ever since. The door to the diner opened, and Ghost did something he hadn't done in 4 years. He went still. Not relaxed still, not resting still, but the absolute frozen stillness of an animal that has identified a threat and is deciding what to do about it. Head up, weight forward, eyes locked. Reed's hand moved to the counter. He didn't look at the door yet. He watched Ghost. The man who walked in was big, 6'2", 230, the kind of mass that came from physical work rather than a gym. Flannel shirt with the sleeves cut off. Jeans, boots caked with red desert clay. He had a face that was handsome, in a blunt way the face of a man who'd gotten everything he wanted from it for 30 years without trying. He was maybe 28. His eyes swept the diner and found Nora in under 2 seconds. People's eyes went to what they were looking for. This man had been looking for Nora before he walked through the door. Nora, not loud, just certain. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Nora's shoulders went rigid. She set the coffee pot down with great care. When she turned to face him, her expression had closed entirely like a window shutting. "Cade, I'm working." "I called you 6 times. I know." "Then you know why I'm here." Ghost had not moved, not 1 millimeter. His eyes stayed on Cade the way a compass needle stays on north. Reed picked up his coffee, drank, watched. "I've got tables," Nora said. Her voice was controlled, but Reed could hear the effort behind it, the way a dam controlled water, not by stopping it, but by redirecting it, and the structure was showing its age. "We can talk later." "We're talking now." Cade moved toward the counter. He walked like a man accustomed to rooms reorganizing themselves around him. The construction workers in the back had gone quiet. The couple by the window was watching their baby very carefully, which meant they were trying not to watch anything else. Nora backed up half a step. Small motion. She probably didn't know she'd done it. "Cade, please." He reached the counter, put both hands on it, leaned, not touching her, not yet, but the intent was legible. "You think you can just stop answering and I'll disappear? You think that's how this works?" "I think I'm at work and I'd like to finish my shift." "You'd like," he said it like it was funny. "You'd like to finish your shift. That's what you'd like." Reed set his coffee cup down. "Hey." Cade turned, took Reed in slowly. The gray beard, the leather jacket, the prosthetic visible below the hem of his jeans where the right leg was real and the left was not. A slow, assessing smile spread across Cade's face, the smile of a man who'd just decided something was not a problem. "Help you, old man?" "Just watching you talk yourself into something you don't want," Reed said. His voice was even. He had not raised it. He didn't need to. "She said she's working." That's a clear answer to a question I didn't hear anyone ask you. "This is a private conversation. Rather than have it somewhere private." Cade straightened. His hands came off the counter. He was calculating Reed could see it happening. The arithmetic of size and age, and the math that had always worked for him before big man's small town, nobody ever pushed back. The math wasn't adding up the way it usually did, and that was irritating him. "You don't know what you're stepping into." "I know what I'm looking at," Reed said. The door opened again. The man who walked in wore a sheriff's uniform. 60, maybe 62, iron gray hair, military short, a gut that had grown in the last decade, but shoulders that remembered what they'd carried before that. His face was made of hard plains and bad weather, and the particular flatness that men developed when they'd spent decades making decisions nobody thanked them for. His badge read Sheriff W. Culver. He took in the room in 3 seconds, his son facing a one-legged stranger, the rigid waitress, the silent diner. His expression didn't shift. "Cade." Just the name. That was enough. Cade stepped back. Both hands came up in the mock surrender of a man who had done this before and found it worked. "Just talking, Dad. We're fine." Sheriff Culver's eyes moved to Reed. They were evaluating Eye's cop, eyes the kind that had seen everything in my own and decided most of it wasn't worth their time. But underneath that was something Reed recognized from the mirror. Something that had been making decisions it didn't entirely stand behind. "You passing through?" Culver asked. "That's the plan." "Good plan." A pause. "Crestfall's a quiet town. We work hard to keep it that way." Reed nodded once. He understood the translation. He'd heard it in a dozen languages in a dozen countries. This was the one that meant cause trouble and regret it. Culver jerked his head toward the door. Cade went. Not before he looked at Nora again, a long look that delivered its message without words. Culver followed his son out without another word to anyone. The diner breathed. The construction workers went back to their food. The couple by the window found something else to look at. The truckers scrolled their phones. Nora appeared at Reed's elbow with the coffee pot. Her hands were not entirely steady now. She refilled his cup without being asked. "You didn't have to do that," she said, quiet, directed at the counter. "Yes, I did." She was silent for a moment. Then lower, "He'll come back. He always comes back." "I know." She looked at him then, really looked for the first time. Something moved through her expression too fast to name. Then she was gone, moving back down the counter, refilling things that didn't need refilling, keeping her hands busy. In the far corner of the diner, in a booth by the window, where you could see the door and the parking lot and most of the street, sat a woman with white hair and hands folded on the table in front of her. She was watching Reed, Evelyn Strand. He'd have known her anywhere. She'd aged, of course she had, but the bones of her face were the same, and the sharpness of her eyes hadn't dimmed an hour. She was 81 and afraid and trying not to show it. Reed had seen that combination before. It looked like exactly this. He carried his coffee to her booth. Ghost padded beside him. Evelyn's eyes went to the dog and something softened in her for a moment. Joe always wanted a German shepherd, she said. I know. He told me. Reed sat, Ghost settled at his feet. Outside through the window, Cade Culver was climbing into a pickup truck. His father was already gone. Thank you for coming, Evelyn said. You asked. That's enough. She looked at him for a long moment. You haven't changed. I have. You just remember the other one. She smiled small and real. Reed. She reached into her handbag, an old leather purse worn at the corners. She set a USB drive on the table between them. Black, no markings, small enough to fit in a closed fist. Joe left this. Reed looked at it. What's on it? A video. He recorded it 3 days before he deployed to Fallujah. I didn't find it until 6 months after the funeral. He'd built a compartment under the bedroom floorboard. We joked about it after September 11th, where we'd hide things if the world went wrong. She stopped. I've watched it many times. Every time I think I understand it, and then I watch it again and I realize I understand a little less. You went to the FBI. Twice. The first time they took the drive and gave it back 3 weeks later. Said they'd found no evidence of wrongdoing. The second time they didn't even take it. They suggested I was suffering from complicated grief. Her voice was steady. Years of having her testimony dismissed had given it a particular quality like metal that had been struck so many times it no longer rang. Owen went to them too, on his own without telling me. About 14 months ago, he was more methodical than I was. He had documents, records from the county, property filings. She looked at the table. He was dead within 6 weeks. Brake failure. Brake failure. She looked up. Owen was a mechanical engineer, Reed. He built his own motorcycle engine from a kit when he was 19. He was meticulous. He would never. She stopped herself. I am not a woman who believes in conspiracy theories. I am an 81-year-old retired school teacher from Virginia who moved to Nevada when Joe was buried here because I could not stand the idea of him being alone in this desert. But I am telling you my son did not die because his brakes failed. Ghost lifted his head from Reed's boot. His ears swiveled toward the kitchen. One small movement, then still again. Reed reached out and closed his fist around the USB drive. It was warm from Evelyn's purse, or from the weight of what it contained. Where can I watch it tonight? My house, 2 miles north on Route 12, blue mailbox. The computer Owen set up is still there. She paused. I should warn you, it's not easy to watch. I know how to watch hard things. She looked at his leg, at the dog tags visible at the collar of his jacket, at the lines in his face that 20 years of high desert living had put there. Yes, she said, I suppose you do. He left 2 20s on the table for a cup of coffee. Evelyn watched him go with an expression he recognized from the faces of people who had waited a very long time for someone to come through the door. Not hope exactly, something more careful than hope. The thing that survived hope once hope had been tested past its limit. Outside, the afternoon light had gone gold and long. Reed stood by the Harley a moment. Ghost sat at his heel, face turned up the street. The sheriff's cruiser was gone. Cade's pickup was gone. But in the window of a building 2 blocks north that said Sheriff Crestfall County, a man stood watching, Sheriff Wade Culver, not moving, just watching, taking measure. Reed held his gaze for a moment. Then he started the Harley. The engine sound rolled down Main Street and off the storefronts and out into the desert in every direction, and somewhere under that sound a smaller one. Tap, 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 3 knocks against carbon fiber and titanium against the place where something important used to be. Reed followed the road north. Evelyn's taillights led him through the evening toward a blue mailbox in a widow's house, and whatever Joe Strand had needed to say before he went to a place he couldn't come back from. The desert was going dark around him. The first stars appeared. Ghost pressed his weight against Reed's back, warm and steady, and Reed understood. The dog sensed it too. The gathering weight of what they were riding toward. The shape of something that had been waiting 20 years to be seen. Evelyn's house sat at the end of a gravel road that the county had apparently given up on improving sometime in the 90s. The building was clabbered white paint gone chalky, a porch that sagged on the left. The kind of house built to last and then left to do its lasting without help. A light burned in the front window. Reed killed the engine and sat a moment in the silence. Ghost hopped out of the sidecar and began his perimeter sweep, nose working the ground, reading the stories written in scent. Evelyn climbed out of her Toyota with the careful deliberateness of someone who had made peace with slowing down. She moved toward the door. Reed followed. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and old paper and the specific quality of rooms where people had lived long and carefully. Photographs covered every surface. Joe in dress blues at 20, grinning like someone had just told him a joke he'd waited his whole life to hear. Joe and Evelyn on their wedding day. A teenage boy with a baseball bat who had Joe's jaw, in Evelyn's eyes, Owen. A family stopped in time, 4 hands on a clock that someone had smashed. The desk in the corner held an old computer, a monitor and a tower. The kind of machine that had been state-of-the-art in 2006 and had spent the subsequent years simply enduring. Owen set it up, Evelyn said. Said I should learn to use the internet. I mostly use it for email. She made coffee even though Reed had said he didn't need any. Her hands steadied when they were occupied. He understood that too. Reed inserted the USB drive while the computer wheezed its way to consciousness. A single file appeared on the desktop. A video file named insurance.mo. Joe had known when he named it that what was on it might be the only protection Evelyn had known that it might not be enough. Reed double-clicked it. The video that opened was poor quality, shot on an old camcorder in low light, the image grainy and overexposed in some places, too dark in others. Joe sat in the front seat of a car with the camera propped on the dashboard. Behind him, darkness. The timestamp in the corner read March 15th, 2006, 11:47 p.m. Joe looked older than Reed remembered. Harder. This was not the man from the wedding photo. This was a man who had seen something he could not unsee and was trying to do the right thing with it before someone stopped him. He cleared his throat. If someone's watching this, he said, then I'm already dead. From the armchair across the room, Evelyn made a sound like a door closing on something that would not close. Joe continued. His voice was low and fast, the voice of a man who knew he might not have long. My name is Staff Sergeant Joseph Strand, United States Marine Corps. I'm recording this as testimony, as evidence, as whatever a lawyer would call it. 3 weeks ago, I came home on emergency leave. My father had a heart attack. They said I was going through his things after the funeral when I found a ledger in the floorboard of his workshop. Dates and amounts and initials. It didn't mean anything to me at first. Then I started matching the dates against records from the depot where my father worked. He was a civilian logistics contractor for the Army Supply Depot outside Henderson for 31 years. The dates matched, the amounts matched, and the things being shipped out weren't supplies. Joe paused. He rubbed his face. Even on a bad video, Reed could see how tired he was. He was diverting weapons, military hardware marked for decommission and destruction. Instead, it was leaving the depot in civilian trucks and going somewhere else. I don't know all the destinations, but the ledger showed 15 years of it. M240 machine guns, M67 grenades, shoulder-fired rockets, things that were supposed to be reduced to scrap. And the person coordinating that, the one whose initials are on every page. Joe leaned toward the camera. His eyes were the same eyes Reed remembered from Kuwait, from Fallujah, from the 1,000 hours they'd spent together over 2 decades. But there was something in them now that hadn't been there before. Not fear. Joe Strand had never been much for fear. It was grief. The specific grief of a man who'd found out that someone he believed in was not what he believed. Colonel Grant Merritt, our commanding officer. Reed's hand closed on the edge of the desk. Merritt who had given the speeches, who had stood in front of them in Kuwait with the flag behind him and talked about duty and honor and what they were fighting for. Who had pinned medals on Reed's chest and shaken his hand and looked him in the eye and said, "Good work, soldier. You made us proud." "He's been running this operation for at least 20 years, Joe said. Probably longer. He uses military connections to flag weapons for decommission, then intercepts them before they're destroyed. They move through civilian contractors. My father was one of them, and then they disappear. Black market, probably. Cartels, militias, whoever's paying." In the video, headlights appeared behind Joe's car, distant but approaching. Joe glanced toward them, turned back. "I confronted him yesterday, told him I knew, told him I had the ledger." He laughed. "Said a ledger with initials was not enough for a court-martial. Said my father was dead and couldn't testify, and then—" Joe stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked. "He said you're deploying to Fallujah next week. Urban combat, IEDs everywhere. It would be a shame if something happened to you." The room was very quiet. Evelyn had gone to the window. Her back was straight and her hands were clasped behind her, and she was looking at the dark desert like she was trying to see through it to something on the other side. "So I'm making this." Joe looked directly at the camera, at whoever would eventually be sitting in front of a bad computer in a small Nevada town watching him speak. "I'm making this because if I die over there, if it's an IED or a sniper or anything that looks like combat, you need to know it wasn't random." Merritt said he has people, engineers who could place devices, intel officers who could redirect patrols. He knows how war works. He knows how to make murder look like the cost of doing business. "I'm hiding this drive at the house. Evelyn knows where. The place we talked about, sweetheart. The place we joked about." He looked at the camera for a long moment. Something crossed his face fast and private. Then he straightened. "I'm going to try to get footage. There's a warehouse on the north end of Henderson, off 215. The shipments come through on Thursday nights. If I can get faces and plates and serial numbers, maybe that's enough even without the ledger." He grabbed the camera. The image spun night sky, ground the interior of the car, those hands on the wheel. Then it steadied on a warehouse lit by flood lamps. A semi-truck backed up to a loading dock. 4 men standing in the light. Joe zoomed in as far as the camera would allow. Reed recognized one of the men immediately. Younger, 20 pounds lighter, hair dark instead of iron gray. But the face was the same face that had stood in the window of the Crest Falls Sheriff's office 2 hours ago, watching Reed ride out the town. Wade Culver, in a county sheriff's uniform, directing the unloading of military crates from a civilian truck. Joe's voice behind the camera, serial numbers. M240 crate of 12, M67 grenades case of 48, Jesus. A pause. One of them just turned around. Motion, the camera swinging, feet on gravel, Joe running. "If you're watching this," Joe's voice ragged, now urgent, "I didn't make it. Tell Evelyn. Tell her I'm sorry, and tell Reed." The camera jerked. The image showed roof window, the whites of Joe's knuckles on the wheel. "Tell him semper fi, always faithful." Engine, tires. Then darkness. The video ended. Reed sat in front of the screen for a long time. Behind him, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Ghost had come to his side. The dog leaned against his leg. 8 days later, Evelyn said. Still at the window. IED in Fallujah. The device was hidden in a dead mound on the side of the road. Standard insurgent tactic, they told me. He was clearing a route. Routine operation. It wasn't routine. No. She turned. Her eyes were dry. past the point where tears did anything. It wasn't. Reed pulled the USB drive from the computer, closed his hand around it. You said Owen found documents. In the drawer. She gestured toward the desk. He left a copy at his apartment. I found it when I was cleaning his things. Reed opened the drawer. Inside was a manila folder worn at the edges, the kind of folder that had been handled many times by someone who was trying to understand it. He laid it open on the desk. Property records, county filings, business registrations, the work of someone methodical, someone who had known what to look for and how to look. A mining company, Desert Lithium Holdings, LLC, incorporated in Nevada 4 years ago. Property purchases throughout the county listed parcels on Bureau of Land Management land, public land, federal land, lithium. Reed looked up. Electric vehicles, Evelyn said. Batteries. Owen said the deposits under this county are worth more than anything in the ground here has ever been worth. Billions. Maybe more. Reed turned through the pages. Shell companies stacked on shell companies, the financial architecture of someone who understood how to move behind curtains. But Owen had been patient. He'd followed the paper trail through layers of names and addresses and registered agents to the end. One name, Grant Merritt. He's moved, Reed thought. Adapted. The weapons trafficking was 20 years old, probably winding down, probably too risky in the current environment. But this lithium mining on federal land through enough shell companies that nothing ever pointed back to you, this was the next chapter. This was what you did when you'd spent 30 years learning how systems worked and who could be bought and how to make records say what you needed them to say. Sheriff Culver, local enforcement, the man who made sure no one asked the wrong questions, who made sure that when brake lines failed on mountain roads, the investigation went nowhere. Reed closed the folder. From outside came the sound he'd been half expecting. Motorcycles. Multiple engines, the specific sound of Harley-Davidsons ridden by men who had been riding them long enough to know exactly how hard to push. They came down the gravel road in formation and pulled up in a loose arc in front of the house. 5 bikes, 5 men climbing off, all of them wearing the same patch Reed wore. Luther Wrench Kane led them. 65, built like a fire hydrant, beard gone gray and long. Luther had been fixing engines since before Reed could remember and had spent 30 years in the Navy maintaining things that couldn't be allowed to fail. Behind him came Vernon Preacher Hayes, thin and long, with a kind of stillness that came from having made peace with his particular place in the world. Otis Rattlesnake Webb moved with the economy of a man who had spent years behind a long rifle and still thought in his trajectories. Floyd Hammer Briggs had an engineer's eyes and hands that were never entirely still. And Silas Doc Montgomery, who had sewn up more men in more bad situations than most surgeons saw in a full career. Brothers, not by blood, by everything that mattered more. Reed stepped out onto the porch. Ghost followed. Took you long enough, Reed said. Luther grinned. The grin of a man who had heard that sentence many times and found it amusing every time. Had to gas up in Fallon. Preacher needed a restroom with standards. The facilities were genuinely substandard, Vernon said with the serenity of a man who had accepted this about himself. The others laughed, the easy laughter of men who didn't need to perform anything for each other. But their eyes were working, taking in the house, the road, the angles. Men who'd been in bad situations knew what the approach to one looked like. Luther gripped Reed's hand. How bad? Bad enough that Joe's dead, that his son is dead, that a colonel has been running weapons for 20 years and is now mining federal land for lithium, and the county sheriff is his ground crew. Luther took this in. He had the gift of processing difficult information without letting it show on his face. What do we have? A video, property records, a woman whose husband and son are both dead from what they called accidents. FBI twice. Both times nothing. Luther looked at the others. Something passed between the 5 of them, silent, inconclusive. What do you need from us? Reed looked back at the house, at the window where Evelyn was visible standing very still, watching men she didn't know decide whether to help her. I need eyes on the mining operation tonight. I need to know what's happening up there and what they're planning to move. He looked at Otis. Rattlesnake, I need you to run a recon. No contact, no engagement, just a read. Otis nodded. I'll take Floyd. Good. Luther, I need you to drive to Reno tonight. There's a state AG and investigator. You know anyone in the AG's office, someone who can't be bought. Might, I'll find out. Take everything Owen Strand documented. The shell companies, the property records, all of it. If we can get someone in the state system interested, we have a path that doesn't require us to go through the local sheriff. And in the meantime, Silas Vernon, stay with Mrs. Strand. Nobody gets to this house tonight. Both men nodded, no questions. That was the thing about brotherhood. You didn't need to explain your reasons. You needed to trust that the man calling the play had thought it through. Evelyn had come out onto the porch. 5 bikers straightened almost involuntarily the reflex of men who had been raised a certain way. Ma'am. All 5 of them said it almost simultaneously. Evelyn looked at Reed. You called them. They came. She looked at the 5 men in their leather jackets and their worn road boots, the Iron Brotherhood patches gleaming faintly in the porch light. Something moved through her expression that Reed couldn't entirely read. Not hope. Something after hope. Joe would have liked you, she said. He always said the best men he ever met weren't the ones everyone expected. Joe was right about most things, Luther said. She looked at Reed one more time, searching his face for something she apparently found because she nodded. Bring Nora home, she said. She's got nowhere else. Reed hadn't known the waitress was part of this yet. But from the way Evelyn said it, the simple, particular certainty of it, he understood she'd been watching the diner, watching Nora putting pieces together in the long, slow way of someone with time and attention to spare. Tell me about Nora, he said. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She came back to Crestfall 18 months ago to take care of her mother. Early onset Alzheimer's. Nora had just finished her graduate degree in geology. A company reached out to her through a university contact, she said, and offered her a contract survey job. Good money short term. She was to assess the geological composition of several parcels in Crestfall County. Reed understood immediately where this was going. She found the lithium. Her report confirmed what they'd suspected, but needed a professional to certify. And then they asked her to sign a non-disclosure agreement and disappear. She refused. Said she wouldn't certify anything for a company she couldn't identify. Said there was something wrong with how the permits were structured. And Cade started following her. The week after she refused. Evelyn's voice was quiet and factual. The bruises started a month later. She won't go to the sheriff for obvious reasons. She has nowhere to go because her mother is here and she won't leave her mother. And Evelyn stopped. She's been trying to figure out who hired her. She's been doing her own investigation between shifts at the diner. I've seen her at the library, looking at records. Ghost had lifted his head again. The dog's attention had shifted to the north toward the desert, dark beyond the highway. Reed put his hand on the dog's head for a moment. All right, he said. He looked at his brothers. We eat. We talk through what we know. And tonight we find out what Grant Merritt is planning to do next. They went inside, the living room filled with the sounds of large men trying to make themselves smaller, settling into furniture that had been chosen for different people, speaking quietly because the occasion called for it. Evelyn served coffee and sandwiches and moved through the room with the dignity of a woman who had learned long ago that hospitality was one of the few things that couldn't be taken from you. Reed set up the video on the laptop. They watched it in silence. When it ended, no one said anything for a long moment. Then Luther spoke. 20 years, he said. 20 years. And he's still out there, still running it. Bigger now. More money. Different product. Otis leaned forward. The mine. When do they operate? Rattlesnake's about to find out. Tonight. Tonight. Reed looked around the room, at the faces of men who had seen bad things and decided that wasn't a reason to walk away from worse ones. We have one asset they don't know about yet. What's that? Nora Sutton. She's been investigating on her own. She has a copy of her survey data in the cloud, and she traced the contract back through two shell companies before she hit a wall. He looked at Luther. She got further than Owen did before they stopped her. You think she found something Owen didn't? I think she might know something she doesn't know she knows. She's a geologist who was hired specifically because of what the land contains. She's looked at those parcels more carefully than anyone outside Merritt's operation. That's not nothing. The night outside was complete now. Stars above the desert in their thousands. Somewhere north, a mine was operating in the dark. Evelyn came and sat in the old recliner that had been her husband's and held her coffee in both hands. She looked at the space in the room where 20 years of loss had settled and become furniture. He'd want you to be careful, she said. Joe always said the problem with doing the right thing was that the people who needed stopping didn't have to follow any rules and the people who wanted to stop them did. Reed looked at the dog tags hanging from his jacket where he'd laid it over the back of a chair. Two rectangles of worn silver in the lamplight. He thought about Joe's voice from the video, the urgency of it, the grief. Tell Evelyn I'm sorry. Tell Reed Semper Fi. He picked up the jacket, held it for a moment. We'll be careful, he said. We'll also finish it. Evelyn looked at him. For the first time since he had arrived, something in her face fully opened. Not happiness, something simpler and harder than that. The look of a woman who had been told the truth after 20 years of being told she was wrong. Start tonight, she said. Otis and Floyd left first. No headlights, they killed them a quarter-mile past the house and let the star field be enough. Two men and two bikes disappearing into the desert in the way of men who had spent careers being invisible in places where visibility meant death. Luther left an hour later the laptop bag on his back, containing every document Owen Strand had ever gathered. Vernon and Silas settled into positions in Evelyn's house with the quiet efficiency of men who had pulled night watch before and understood what it required. Reed sat at the desk and read through Owen Strand's documents again, more slowly this time, with the particular attention of a man who was looking for what wasn't there. Owen had been methodical, patient. He had the mind of an engineer, which meant he thought in systems, in cause and effect, in chains of consequence that you followed from one end to the other. He had found the shell companies because he'd known that things didn't come from nowhere. There were always addresses, always registered agents, always some thread that connected the formal to the real. He had pulled that thread, but there was a gap. Owen had gotten through 2 layers of shell companies and hit a wall. The documents ran to a registered agent in Delaware and stopped there. He had noted it. Written in the margin of one page in pencil, DL Holdings/Meridian Partners, LLC/Crestfall Capital. Gap here. Who is Crestfall Capital? Reed stared at that line. He picked up his phone and sent a message to Nora through Evelyn. Ask her who hired her, not the name they gave, the bank account, where the payment came from. 20 years. 20 years since a fireball in a Fallujah alley had rearranged the arithmetic of who lived and who didn't. 20 years since he'd stood at Arlington in borrowed dress blues and watched them fold the flag with the geometric precision of ceremony and hand it to a woman who held it against her chest, like she was trying to keep something from escaping. He had carried Joe's dog tag since that day. Had carried the guilt since before that, since the moment he had understood coming out of the shock and the morphine in a Ramstein hospital bed, that Joe had pushed him and not the other way around. That Joe had made a choice in a fraction of a second with whatever calculations the human mind ran in fractions of seconds and had chosen to let Reed live. You didn't get to repay that. You just got to carry it. But maybe this was something adjacent to repayment. Maybe this was what Semper Fi meant when you got down past the motto and into the bone of it. That you kept going for the ones who couldn't. That you picked up the thread they'd been pulling and you pulled it to the end. His phone buzzed. A message relayed through Evelyn. Nora's response was 3 lines. The payment came from Crestfall Capital LLC. I traced it to a Nevada P.O. box. When I tried to look up the registered agent, I found that the registration had been updated 11 months ago, a week after Owen Strand died. The registered agent is a firm called Merit Administrative Services, LLC. Reed read it twice. Nora had gotten further than Owen. She'd connected the dot Owen had been reaching for when his brakes failed on Highway 93. He typed back, "Don't tell anyone else what you told me. Come to Evelyn's house tomorrow morning. Early." His phone buzzed again. Otis, at the mine, heavy equipment running, 3 shifts, not one. Loading ore into unmarked trucks. North warehouse locked down. 2 guards external, armed, professional. Not rent-a-cops. Then a second message. There's something in the warehouse that isn't ore. Reed read both messages twice. He thought about Joe's video. The crates with stenciled numbers. He typed back, "Don't engage. Get eyes only." Then he sat with his notes and his cold coffee and the sleeping dog at his feet and waited for morning. Outside, Ghost raised his head from the floor. The dog's ears turned toward the north, toward the mine, toward whatever was waiting up there in the locked dark of a warehouse that held something that wasn't ore. Then the man laid his head back down, kept watch in the way he always kept watch, not with anxiety, but with the patient certainty of something that knew exactly what it was built for and intended to be ready when the moment asked for it. Reed looked at the dog tags on the desk where he'd set them. Semper Fi, he thought, always faithful. He turned back to the documents and kept reading. Nora Sutton arrived at Evelyn's house at 6:45 in the morning with dark circles under her eyes and a thumb drive in her jacket pocket, and the particular energy of someone who had not slept because they'd been working instead. She was smaller than Reed remembered from the diner. That happened sometimes when the context changed, when someone stepped out of the role you'd seen them in and into something that fit better. They became more solid. Nora in the diner had been a waitress trying not to be noticed. Nora on Evelyn's porch was something else. Ghost went to her immediately. Not the alert attention he gave to threats, but the low, steady approach he reserved for people he'd decided were worth knowing. He pressed his head against her leg. She put her hand on him without thinking, fingers finding the place behind his ears, the way people did when they'd grown up with dogs, and the gesture was part of their muscle memory. "I've been thinking about what you asked," she said to Reed. She was looking at the way, not at him, the way people sometimes did when they were saying something difficult and needed somewhere else to put their eyes. "The payment came from Crestfall Capital. I traced it to the registered agent, Merit Administrative Services." She looked up. "I looked them up last night. They were registered 18 months ago, 6 weeks before I was hired." "They created the administrative company to hire you?" "Yes." She pulled the thumb drive from her pocket, held it out. "My full survey, all of it. The data, the methodology, my notes, everything. They took my work laptop, but I'd already backed everything to the cloud. When they asked me to sign the NDA, I realized I'd better copy it somewhere else too." Reed took the drive. He didn't look at it yet. He was looking at her. "You said you traced the contract back through 2 shell companies. Desert Lithium Holdings to Meridian Partners to Crestfall Capital. 3 layers. And then I found a name." She said it like she'd been holding it in her mouth and wasn't sure what to do with it. "Grant Merritt. How time Crestfall Capital has a business license. To get a Nevada business license, you need a registered agent and an authorized signatory. The signatory on the original application before they updated it was Grant A. Merritt." She paused. "I don't know who he is. I know he's connected to this. I know he's the reason they wanted me to disappear." Reed thought about Joe's video, about a colonel who had spent 2 decades building something in the dark. "Sit down," he said. "There's something you need to see." He showed her the video. She watched it without speaking. Her hands were flat on her thighs, and she did not look away from the screen, not once, not even at the worst parts. When it ended, she was quiet for a long moment. He knew they were going to kill him, she said. He knew. And they did. Yes. She looked at the blank screen. The man in the video, the one with the military crates, that's Sheriff Culver. When he was younger, yes. I've been going to him, she said. Her voice was very flat. Every time Cade grabbed me. Every time I thought it was bad enough to report. I went to Wade Culver and he took my statement and said he'd look into it, and 2 weeks later, it would happen again. A pause. He was protecting his son, but it was also he needed me scared. Scared people don't ask questions. Reed said nothing. She'd figured it out herself. Sometimes the right thing was to let that happen. The geological survey, she said. Then she stopped. Something was moving in her face, some piece connecting to another piece. The parcels I surveyed. I surveyed 11 parcels across the county. 3 of them were federal land, Bureau of Land Management. You can't mine BLM land without federal permits. And the permits, that's the thing. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, the kind of printout you made at a library because you didn't want it on your home printer. I found the permits. They're real. They're filed correctly, but the name on the application is a company called Nevada Mineral Trust, which is I checked another merit shell company, which means he used a shell company to get permits from a federal agency that's supposed to review them for conflicts of interest. She unfolded the paper. The reviewer who approved the permits is a man named Clifford Harst, Regional BLM Director for Nevada. I looked him up. He retired 14 months ago, a week after Owen Strand died. Reed studied the paper. He covered every angle, he said. He had time to. 20 years of practice. She refolded the paper. And now there's a mine operating on federal land producing lithium that goes into electric vehicle batteries that go into cars that people buy without having any idea any of this happened. She looked at Reed directly. That's the thing that keeps me up. Not just what he did to your friend and to Owen. It's that it keeps going. It's that every day it keeps going. Silas appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to Nora without comment, the other to Reed, and disappeared back into the kitchen. That was Silas. He assessed what was needed and provided it without making a production of it. Nora wrapped her hands around the mug. What are you going to do? We're gathering evidence. Luther Kane drove to Reno last night with Owen's documents. He's making contact with someone in the state AG's office. That could take weeks. We might not have weeks. She looked at him. What do you mean, a rattlesnake? Otis Webb, one of the men I ride with, he did recon on the mine last night. 3 shifts running, heavy activity. And there's a warehouse on the north end and they're keeping locked with armed security. Nora was quiet. She was thinking. Reed could see it happening. Or doesn't need security like that, she said slowly. No. And if they're running 3 shifts, it means they're accelerating, moving something on a deadline. She set down the mug. When did they start the 3-shift operation? Rattlesnake said the activity level looked recent, within the last week. Owen died 11 months ago. What changed in the last week? She was not asking Reed. She was working through it. He let her. The registered agent was updated. The Merit Administrative Services filing, when I found it last night, the date on the update was 6 days ago. 6 days ago. Someone spooked him, Reed said. Something in the last week made him think it was time to move, to accelerate whatever he was planning. Or someone told him someone was asking questions again. They both understood what that meant. Someone in Crestfall, someone who watched, who came and went, who paid attention to strangers who arrived on Harley-Davidsons with German shepherds and sat in corner booths with 81-year-old widows. Someone had already made a phone call. Reed stood. Stay here today. Stay with Evelyn. Don't go to the diner. I have a shift. Call in sick. She started to argue. He looked at her steadily. I watched a video last night of a man who knew someone was going to kill him and went out anyway because he thought he could get one more piece of evidence. He was right that it wasn't enough to stop them. He was right that he didn't make it home. A pause. Stay here today. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. The morning moved. Reed slept for 2 hours on Evelyn's couch. Ghost slept beside him. The pragmatic sleep of men and dogs who took rest when it was available because they had learned not to assume it would be available later. Otis called at 11. He and Floyd had spent the night in positions on the ridgeline above the mine. 3 shifts, 2 supervisors, 8 miners, 4 security personnel, rotating in pairs. The north warehouse had a keypad lock and no windows, but Floyd had gotten close enough during a shift change to watch a guard punch in the code. 8833, Floyd said on the phone, and it's not ore in there. I could hear diesel generators and a ventilation system on a cycle, temperature controlled. Reed wrote the code down. Don't go in, stay in position. Luther called at 1. The state AG contact had taken the documents and listened and made phone calls. She was interested. She had a contact at the FBI field office in Las Vegas, different district from Phoenix, different chain of command. They were moving, but they needed time, at least 8 hours. Reed looked at the clock, 4 in the afternoon, 8 hours. He was in the kitchen getting coffee when Ghost did it again. Not a bark, just movement from the floor to the hallway in one silent shift, body oriented toward the front of the house, weight forward. Reed set down the coffee, went to the window at an angle. A sheriff's cruiser sat at the end of the gravel drive. Wade Culver stood beside it, not in uniform. Civilian clothes. His service weapon holstered but visible. Alone. Reed stepped onto the porch. Ghost came with him. Vernon materialized in the doorway. Culver. Calloway. The sheriff looked at the house, at Vernon, at Ghost. He was carrying something. Reed could see it in the set of his shoulders. I need to talk to you. He told them about the mine, about a locked warehouse holding a weapons cache that Merritt had kept for 10 years, remnants of the original trafficking operation held as leverage as insurance, and about what was happening tonight. They were moving the cache, and they were coming for Nora. He wants her before the weapons move, Culver said. She's the loose end. She has the survey data, she traced the contracts, and she's still in Crestfall. His voice was flat and factual, the voice of a man who had stopped trying to sound better than he was. I warned Merritt when Owen Strand started asking questions. I thought Merritt would just make Owen go away, go somewhere else. I didn't know they would. He stopped. Owen played Little League with my son. He was 10 years old. His jaw worked. I've been living with that for 11 months. I can't do another one. Reed looked at him for a long time. What's the security situation? Culver's shoulders dropped slightly. 6 private security, former military at least 2, IR's body armor. Merritt will be there himself. A pause. He doesn't trust anyone else with this. Go home, Reed said. Stay off your regular channels. Wait for contact. Culver nodded. He looked at the house one more time. She came back here when she didn't have to, he said. Most people her age leave. I know. He drove away. The plan reformed through the afternoon. The AG and FBI were moving but needed time. Nora shared her survey data, and it went to Reno. The pieces were aligning, but the clock was not cooperating. At 6, Otis texted. 2 sentences. Marlene Oaks just drove north on Route 12. Second text. She has a passenger. She went to Nora's house first. She took Nora's mother. Reed turned to the room. To Nora. Her face had gone the color of paper. My mother, she said. It wasn't a question. Marlene took her. My mother thinks Marlene is her friend. 30 years. She won't know to be afraid. Nora pressed her hands flat on the table. Her voice broke on the last word and she caught it and held it. Then she looked up. He wants me to come to him. Yes. He's counting on the fact that I won't leave her there. Yes. Then I have to go. She looked at Reed, but not the way he expects. Reed looked at her. She was scared. Her hands were still pressed flat, a physical effort at steadiness. But she wasn't asking to be talked out of it. She wasn't asking for permission. She was asking for a plan. "You're going to walk into that mine," Reed said, "and you're going to buy us time. And you're going to do one thing while you're buying it. Tell me. Record everything, whatever Merritt says, whatever he tells you about Joe Strand, about Owen, about the operation. Put your phone in your pocket before you walk in and leave it running." Well, she understood immediately. He's going to think it doesn't matter what he says to me. Men who've gotten away with everything for 20 years are always very confident. And confident men talk. Yes. She took out her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She pressed record. Then she put the phone in her jacket pocket and looked at Reed. "Don't be late," she said. "I won't be." Ghost walked to her and pressed against her leg. She put her hand on the dog's head and breathed once slowly. Then she walked out the door. Reed watched her get into Evelyn's car, watched the car turn north on Route 12, watched its tail lights until they were gone. "She's brave," Silas said. "She's scared," Reed said. "Same thing mostly." He went inside, put on his jacket, checked the sidearm. 7 rounds. Ghost sat at his heel. Reed tapped 3 times on the carbon fiber. "Let's go get her," he said. The convoy left Evelyn's house at 8:30. 2 motorcycles, running without headlights, a quarter-mile from the mine. Vernon and Silas had already gone ahead on foot through the desert, moving in the way men moved when they'd spent years in places where being seen was fatal. Floyd had taken the service road to the mine's west perimeter, where the ventilation access was located. Luther was still in Reno, coordinating with the AG contact and sending updates every 20 minutes. The mine sat in a natural bowl in the hills north of Crestfall, between 2 fence lines, razor wire on top. 1 paved road and 1 service road, gravel and dark. Otis had found a gap in the east fence where the ground had shifted enough to pull the base post out of true 18 inches of clearance at the bottom. Enough for a man and a dog. They left the bikes a quarter-mile out. Reed and Ghost went through the gap first. The desert floor was hard-packed and dry, and Ghost moved across it without a sound, his dark coat invisible beyond the mine's light perimeter. The north warehouse sat separate from the main processing buildings. 50 yards of open ground between it and the nearest cover. 2 guards at the front. The floodlights on the main building created a shadow zone along the warehouse's east wall, 15 feet wide, from the southeast corner to the door. Otis went prone on the ridge above. His rifle settled. He texted Reed, "In position." "Got both guards. Say when." Reed crouched in the shadow of a storage trailer. Nora had been inside for 40 minutes. Her phone was recording. What had Merritt said to her in 40 minutes? His own phone buzzed. Floyd found the demolition package. Northwest corner inside the ventilation chase. Standard wiring remote detonator. Working on it. He texted back. "How long? 20 minutes, maybe less." He looked at his watch. 8:57. The FBI and state AG had said they needed until midnight. 3 hours. Enough time if everything held. It did not hold. The warehouse door opened. A man stepped out. 70 years old, carrying himself with the particular uprightness of someone who had worn a uniform for decades and never entirely stopped. Silver hair, a face that had been commanding in its time and had hardened into something colder. He wore civilian clothes, dark and unremarkable, but the posture was the posture of Colonel Grant Merritt, regardless of what covered it. He was holding a phone to his ear. "I understand," he said, his voice carried in the still night air. The voice of a man accustomed to being heard without raising it. "Then accelerate. Get the trucks moving by 10. A pause. "I don't care about the AG. I care about being out of this county before the federal warrant comes through. Move." He ended the call, looked around the yard. His eyes passed over the shadow zone without stopping. He went back inside. Reed exhaled. The FBI timeline had compressed. The warrant was coming, and Merritt knew it or knew enough to assume it. He was moving the weapons by 10. 2 hours ahead of schedule, Reed typed to Floyd faster. We have 90 minutes, then to Otis standby to engage on my signal. We're going early. He waited for Floyd's response. 12 minutes. I can do it in 12. 12 minutes. Reed looked at the warehouse door, at the two guards, at the dark open ground between the storage trailer and the shadow zone. He texted Wade Culver now. 40 seconds later, the sheriff's cruiser turned off the paved road and came down the service road with its lights on. Not lights and sirens, just the cruiser, Culver alone driving in like an official visit, official business. The guards at the warehouse door watched the cruiser come. Their bodies turned toward it. Reed moved. Ghost moved with him, silent and synchronized, crossing the open ground in 7 seconds. Into the shadow, along the east wall, Reed kept his back against the building and moved without rushing. The guards were still watching Culver's cruiser. He had parked it at an angle that required them to turn almost entirely away from the door. Reed reached the door. Keypad, he punched in 8833. The lock disengaged. He pulled the door open, slipped inside. Ghost followed. The interior was large and cold generators filling the air with a low mechanical hum. Crates stacked along the walls, military crating with stenciled markings. The smell of gun oil and metal and something older. The smell of things that had been stored in darkness for a long time. In the center of the warehouse under a work light, two people sat facing each other. Nora and Grant Merritt. Merritt sat in a folding chair with the ease of a man conducting a routine meeting. He was speaking low and even the tone of someone who considered explanation a courtesy he was choosing to extend. Nora sat across from him, hands on her knees, back straight, using every available muscle not to show fear. Her phone was in her jacket pocket. Recording. Neither of them had heard Reed come in. Reed moved along the inside wall, staying in the shadow outside the worklight circle. Ghost went flat and still invisible against the base of the crates. Merritt was speaking. Joseph Strand was a good soldier, he was saying. That's the honest assessment. Better than average. He had integrity. That's a useful quality in a subordinate and a liability in someone who finds out things they shouldn't find out. Nora said nothing. His father was a different kind of man. Practical. Understood that systems have participants at every level and that participation requires compensation. He was compensated well for 15 years. When he died, I assumed the matter was closed. Merritt paused. Joseph surprised me. I didn't anticipate that he'd go through his father's things with enough attention and to find the ledger. I underestimated the thoroughness of grief. He tried to go to you, Nora said. Her voice was steady. She was keeping him talking. She understood exactly what she was doing. He confronted you directly. He did. He thought confrontation was a path to resolution. Merritt's voice carried a kind of tired patience. I told him the truth, that what he had wasn't enough, that going to his superior officer with a dead man's ledger and some dates that matched shipping records wasn't evidence. It wasn't. I was right about that. A pause. The alternative resolution was regrettable. You had him killed. I had a problem managed. The distinction matters in how you think about it. If you think of every action in its most inflammatory terms, you can't function. Merritt's voice was even and certain. The certainty of a man who had told himself this story so many times it had become true inside him. The operation I've built provides tax revenue, employs over 60 people, contributes to the supply chain of an industry that this country's future depends on. Joseph Strand would have disrupted all of that. He paused. His son would have disrupted it, and you would disrupt it, Miss Sutton. That's why we're having this conversation. Reed stepped into the light. It's also recorded, he said. Merritt turned. His face registered Reed's presence with the controlled assessment of a man who did not startle easily. His eyes went to the door, to Ghost appearing from the shadows, to Reed's sidearm. Sergeant Calloway, he said, you're older than I expected. You had someone describe me. Marlene is thorough. No change in his voice, no panic, just the recalibration of a man adjusting his position on a game board. You understand that this changes nothing. The weapons are being removed from this facility in 70 minutes. Whatever is on that phone, he looked at Nora's jacket pocket. A recording made without consent in Nevada is inadmissible. Nevada is a two-party consent state, Reed said. You're right about that. Merritt's expression shifted slightly. But federal jurisdiction preempts state evidence rules, Reed said. And this is a federal matter. Has been since the weapons left the depot the first time 20 years ago. He held up his phone. A text from Luther just arrived. FBI Las Vegas executing federal warrant. ETA to mine 45 minutes. Merritt read it. His face did the thing that very confident men's faces did when the architecture they'd built began to show cracks. It went still. Not calm. Still. The stillness of something trying not to move while the ground shifted under it. Outside, Reed said, there are two men who know where you've hidden the demolition package on this building. One of them is disabling it right now. The other has your security detail in his sights from the ridge. He looked at Merritt steadily. Your plan to destroy the evidence and disappear is done. You can walk out of here under your own power, or you can wait for the FBI to come in after you. Either way, you're not walking out of Nevada tonight. A long silence. Ghost moved to Nora's side. She put her hand on the dog's head. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. The first real release she'd allowed herself in 2 hours. Merritt looked at Reed, at the thing, at Nora, at the phone with Luther's text still visible. And for the first time in the conversation, something crossed his face that was not controlled. Not the patient certainty of a man explaining himself from a position of advantage. It was the expression of a man who had spent 20 years being untouchable and was understanding in this particular moment in a cold warehouse in a Nevada mining operation that untouchable had always been a temporary condition. The woman with Alzheimer's, Reed said. Where is she? A pause. In the main building. She's unharmed. She doesn't know where she is. Another pause. I'm not without limits. Go get her, Reed said to Nora. Nora stood. She looked at Merritt for one moment, a look that contained things Reed couldn't inventory. Then she walked past him without a word and out the warehouse door into the Nevada night. Reed looked at Merritt. Sit down, he said. We'll wait for the FBI together. Merritt sat back in the folding chair. His posture was still correct. That didn't change. Joseph Strand, Merritt said, he was the best EOD tech I ever commanded. I know, Reed said. He was my brother. The generators hummed. The climate system cycled. Outside, the desert was very dark and very still. And somewhere in the hills above the mine, a man with a long rifle watched and waited and kept the perimeter. The FBI arrived at 11:47, not 45 minutes 47. Luther's estimate had been close. Those 2 extra minutes had felt like 2 hours in the cold interior of the warehouse with Reed standing and Merritt sitting, and Ghost lying between them, every sense tuned to the room. Merritt had not tried to run, had not tried to negotiate. He had simply sat with the posture of a man who had been a colonel and understood that some positions once lost required dignity in the losing. Whatever else he was not a man who begged. The federal agent who came through the warehouse door first was a woman named Keswick. Mid-40s, close-cropped hair, the build and movement of someone who had spent time in the field before making the transition to federal law enforcement. She took in the scene without visible surprise. Calloway, she said. Yes. Diane Foss sends her regards. She looked at Merritt. Grant Allen Merritt, you're under arrest for federal weapons trafficking, wire fraud, fraudulent acquisition of federal land use permits, conspiracy to commit murder, and murder in the first degree. That's the short list. Merritt stood. He put his hands out without being asked. The bearing of a man who understood procedure. There was something almost theatrical about it. The performance of cooperation from someone who had cooperated with nothing for 20 years. They let him out. Outside, 3 FBI vehicles and 2 state police cruisers lined the service road. Floodlights on stands turned the mine yard white and clinical. The security guards were on their knees with their hands behind their heads. Floyd was standing with an FBI agent showing photographs from the night's recon. Otis came down from the ridge only when the perimeter was fully secured. That was how Otis operated. He held his position until the situation resolved. Nora came around the corner of the main building with her arm around her mother. Patricia Sutton was 73, small and white-haired, wearing a cardigan that had been put on inside out. Her eyes moved across the scene in the unfocused way of someone whose map of the world had developed significant gaps. But she was holding Nora's arm, and Nora was talking to her quietly, and Patricia was not frightened. She was simply somewhere she didn't entirely understand. Ghost walked to them. He sat beside Patricia and looked up at her with the patient attention he gave to people who needed it. The old woman's hand came down automatically and rested on the dog's head. Something in her expression settled. "Good boy," Nora said to Ghost. She looked at Reed. Her eyes were wet, though she was not crying. The wet eyes of someone who had been in controlled terror for 2 hours and was processing its departure. "She's okay. She's confused, but she's okay." "Good." Marlene was kind to her, Nora said. Her voice was careful. On the drive up, kept talking to her about things they'd done together. Old things, familiar things. She stopped. "I think Marlene actually cares about my mother, genuinely, and she still made the call that sent Owen to his death." "People contain more than one thing," Reed said. "That's not a comfort. It's just true." Wade Culver sat on the bumper of his cruiser with his badge in his hand, looking at it the way a man looked at something he was about to turn in. Agent Keswick stood nearby, giving him space to arrive at the moment himself. Reed walked over. Culver looked up. The badge turned slowly in his fingers. "My son," Culver said. "He's going to need a lawyer." "Yes." He didn't. Cade never knew about the weapons, about any of the merit operation. I kept him out of that. He paused. "He's still going to face charges for Nora, what he did to her." "Yes." "That's right." Culver set the badge on his knee. "That's the right thing, I know that." He was quiet a moment. "Owen Strand had a fiancée. Did you know that?" "No." "Girl named Lisa. She moved away after he died, back to wherever she was from." He turned the badge over. "I think about her sometimes, whether she's okay." He put the badge in his jacket pocket. "I know it doesn't change anything, me thinking about her." "We know," Reed said, "but it means something that you do." Lieutenant Keswick came over. She spoke to Culver quietly. He stood, handed her the badge, and walked to the waiting vehicle. He didn't look at anyone as he went. Otis came and stood beside Reed. They watched the federal agents work the scene. "Joe Strand," Otis said. "I never knew him. Good man. Best EOD tech I ever worked with. Worth doing this for." Reed looked at the dog tags hanging from his jacket in the floodlit night. 2 rectangles of worn silver. "Yes," he said. "Worth doing this for." The Nevada desert was beginning its slow drift toward dawn, the sky at the eastern edge going from black to the particular deep blue that came just before light. Nora's mother had fallen asleep on a folding chair someone had brought out for her. Her hand still resting on Ghost's back, the dog sitting beside her with absolute patience. Nora stood a little ways off, watching her mother sleep. Her hands were in her jacket pockets. The phone that had been recording was in one of them. She looked like someone who had been very far from where she needed to be and had just arrived. Reed walked over and stood beside her. They watched the sky begin to change. "She won't remember this," Nora said, about her mother. "Tomorrow she won't remember any of it. She'll think she just slept at home." "Is that a bad thing?" Nora thought about it. "No," she said. "I think it's the best thing." She breathed. "I'll remember for both of us." The first federal helicopter appeared over the southern ridge searchlight, cutting the pre-dawn dark, moving toward the mine. Secondary teams, more evidence techs. The beginning of what would be a very long process of accounting. Reed thought about what it meant that all of this had taken 20 years. That Joe had died in 2006, and it was now this particular morning, and only now were the pieces in position to mean something. He thought about all the things that had had to happen exactly as they happened. Nora taking the geology contract, refusing the NDA, tracing the shell companies, staying in Crestfall when leaving would have been easier, Luther having a contact in the AG's office, Floyd having the patience and precision to find a secondary demolition package in a ventilation chase in the dark, and Reed himself answering a letter from an 81-year-old woman who had waited 20 years to tell the truth. All of it had to happen, and most of it came down to people deciding not to look away. Ghost moved, just stood from where he'd been sitting beside Patricia, stretched the way dogs stretched, when a long alert was ending, and walked to Reed's side. He pressed against Reed's leg, looked up. Reed put his hand on the dog's head. 20 years ago, Joe Strand had pushed Reed out of the way of a fireball and died in the space that Reed had been standing in. Reed had spent 2 decades understanding that is debt, as a weight he carried because there was no other way to carry it. He understood now that he'd been wrong about the shape of it. It wasn't debt, it was direction. Joe hadn't saved Reed's life so that Reed could spend it feeling guilty about being alive. Joe had saved Reed's life because that was what you did for your brother. And what you did with the life you'd been given was you used it. You kept going. You picked up the thread when it needed picking up. He looked at the dog tags. Thank you, he said, low to the desert, to wherever it went when you said things to the dead and meant them. The dawn was coming, and there was still work to do. The trial took 11 months. Reed was not there for most of it. He was in New Mexico for 6 weeks after Crestfall, then Montana, then back to Flagstaff, then a call from a woman in Colorado whose brother had disappeared into a situation that reminded Reed of things he recognized. The road had a way of generating need. Men who knew how to move toward trouble rather than away from it were never without somewhere to go. But he followed the trial. Luther sent updates from the court filings. Nora sent messages when something significant happened, written the way she wrote everything factual precise. The habits of a scientist who had learned to trust evidence over impression. The federal case was built on 4 foundations. The geological survey and documentation Nora had gathered, tracing the shell company chain to Merritt's name. Owen Strand's property research recovered from his apartment and authenticated. Joe Strand's video admitted under federal rules of evidence, 2-party consent laws did not apply to federal investigations, as Reed had told Merritt in the warehouse. And Merritt's lawyer spent 3 weeks arguing otherwise and lost. And Nora's recording from inside the warehouse, 37 minutes of Merritt's voice explaining the architecture of his operations to a woman he believed would not survive the night. Merritt's lawyers were expensive and experienced. They challenged everything. The chain of custody on Joe's video, the methodology of Nora's geological survey, the standing of Owen Strand's documents given that he had not been a licensed investigator. They filed 43 motions in the first 8 weeks and won 9 of them. None of the 9 they won touched the warehouse recording. 37 minutes of Grant Merritt explaining in his own measured and confident voice how he had managed the situation that Joseph Strand had presented to him, how the operation worked, how the permits had been arranged, how Wade Culver had been useful over the years, how Marlene Oakes had functioned as an information source, how he thought about the difference between decisive action and unnecessary violence, a distinction he appeared to find philosophically important. Merritt's lawyers argued that the recording was obtained under duress, that Nora had been held against her will, that anything she elicited in those circumstances was tainted. The federal judge disagreed. Nora had not been compelled to press record. Merritt had not been compelled to speak. The decision that morning in the warehouse to keep Merritt talking, that had been Nora's, made freely with understanding of what she was doing and why. The verdict came back on a Tuesday in October, 11 months after the mine. Guilty on 31 counts. Nora sent Reed the message at 7 in the morning Nevada time, knowing he'd be awake. He was sitting in a truck stop outside Albuquerque with Ghost under the table, and a cup of coffee that needed replacing, and a napkin on which he had been working through a problem that didn't have a clean solution yet. His phone lit up. 31 counts. Life, no parole. He read it twice, set the phone down, looked out the window at the New Mexico morning, the flat light coming off the mesa to the east, the kind of morning that was indifferent to everything human beings did under it, and somehow made the human things matter more for that indifference. Ghost put his head on Reed's boot. Reed reached down and touched the dog tags at his collar. Two pieces of worn silver that had spent 20 years being carried. Got him, Joe, he said, quietly, to no one in the diner, to the desert outside, to wherever it went when you said things to the dead and meant them. He paid for the coffee and walked out into the morning. Wade Culver had taken a deal 8 months earlier. Conspiracy to obstruct justice accessory after the fact, failure to report a crime. He had testified against Merritt for 4 days, and his testimony, combined with the documentary evidence, had made the weapons trafficking charges airtight. He was sentenced to 7 years. His lawyer thought he'd serve 4 with good behavior. His son Cade was convicted on 3 counts of aggravated assault and 1 count of stalking. 2 years suspended with anger management and a 5-year restraining order, keeping him away from Nora Sutton and Cresval County. Reed thought this was insufficient. He had said so to Luther, who had agreed, and to Vernon, who had said something from Scripture about the long arc and the bending. Reed was not a patient man by nature, but he had learned in 67 years that some inadequate outcomes were the best available outcomes, and the alternative to accepting them was deciding you could do better than a federal court, which was a decision that led to places Reed had no interest in going. Marlene Oakes had turned herself into the county jail the morning after the mine, walking in at 5 a.m. and telling the night deputy everything she knew in order, beginning with the first time she had called Merritt's number and ending with the drive to Nora's house with Patricia Sutton in the passenger seat. She had pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and conspiracy. She had received 5 years probation and 100 hours of community service, and had been required to write a formal apology to Evelyn Strand, which she had done, and which Evelyn had read once and then put in a drawer. It was a good letter, Evelyn had said when Reed asked. That doesn't mean I know what to do with it. Reed understood. Some things you held and didn't resolve. That was okay. Resolution was overrated. Carrying was what you actually did. He drove back to Cresval 6 months after the verdict. The Harley needed the run. Ghost needed the wind. And there was something Reed needed to see for himself, not because Luther's updates or Nora's messages were inadequate, but because some things you needed to stand inside to understand. He came in from the south on the highway the same approach he'd taken 18 months earlier, with Joe's dog tags swinging from the mirror, and 20 years of guilt navigating by dead reckoning. The desert looked the same. The hills north of town were the same brown and red and beige of everything that stayed because it had learned how to stay. The town was different, not dramatically, not the way movies showed things changing, with fresh paint and children running and music from somewhere. Just the ordinary different of a place that had been under a particular pressure for a very long time and had that pressure released. The gas station had new pumps. The church had new paint on the steeple. 2 stores that had been empty when Reed first came through were open now. The mine was still operating. The lithium was still there, but it was operating now under federal oversight with a legitimate permitting process and an environmental review and a labor agreement, and the money it generated went to the people who worked it in the county that hosted it, and not through layers of shell companies to a man in a federal prison upstate. Rosalie's Diner had a new sign. Nora's, it said, in blue letters, clean and plain, all the letters working. Reed pulled into the gravel lot. Ghost hopped out of the sidecar and shook himself and lifted his nose to the air. The smells were familiar now. Not the first Reed of an unknown place, but the second Reed of somewhere the dog had been before and had an opinion about. The door chimed when Reed pushed it open. The interior was different but recognizable. New paint the same cream color. New booths, the same vinyl red. The pie case held four options, now apple, cherry, pecan, and blueberry. The counter was the same counter, just clean in a way that felt intentional rather than habitual. Nora was behind the counter. She looked, Reed thought, like someone who had found the shape of the thing she was supposed to be doing. Not happy in a simple way, but settled. The way things settled when they'd found where they belonged. She looked up, saw him. Something opened in her face. "You're late," she said. "New Mexico runs long." "I heard." She poured a cup of coffee without being asked, set it in front of the stool at the end of the counter, the stool with the sight line to the door. "Sit down." He sat. Ghost went under the counter and lay down. A customer at the far booth glanced over and then went back to his paper, which was the correct response to a large German shepherd in a diner. "Your mother," Reed asked. "At the facility in Reno. Better care. I drive up on Thursdays." She wiped the counter. "There are good days. She knew me last week. We talked about geology for 20 minutes. She used to teach earth science at the middle school." Nora paused. "I didn't know that. We talked for 20 minutes and I learned things about my mother I'd never known." "Good days are real things," Reed said. "Yes." She set down the cloth. "Evelyn is here every morning at 7. We have coffee. She reads the paper. We don't usually talk about the trial or any of it. We talk about other things. She's been teaching me to bake." "Evelyn bakes." "Apparently Joe loved her blueberry pie. She said she stopped making it after he died. She started again last month." Nora nodded toward the pie case. "That's why there's four options now." Reed looked at the blueberry pie, at the golden crust and the deep blue filling visible at the lattice edge. "Is it good?" "It's extraordinary," Nora said. "It's the best thing I've ever eaten. I don't know how to explain that. It's just pie." "But—" "I know," Reed said. She poured coffee for herself and leaned on the counter. The morning light came through the window and fell across the counter in long rectangles. "A man came in last week," she said. "Late 30s, army jacket, walking careful, new prosthetic, you could tell from how he was placing his feet. He sat in the corner booth and drank 3 cups of coffee and didn't talk to anyone. And Ghost—" She looked at the dog. "Ghost went and sat with him. Ghost does that. He stayed there an hour. When the man left, he left $12 for coffee and a note on a napkin." She reached under the counter, slid the napkin to Reed. On it, in a careful hand, "Thank you, that's all?" "Just that." Reed held the napkin. "I've been keeping it," Nora said. "I don't know why. It just felt like something worth keeping." "It is," Reed said. He put the napkin down, drank his coffee. Outside, a car pulled in and 2 women got out with a baby navigating the gravel carefully. The bell chimed. Nora went to greet them. Reed watched the room, the habit of 40 years, entrances and exits, positions and angles, but quieter now, less urgent. The room was a room, not a threat assessment. Ghost reappeared from under the counter and lay across Reed's boots with the comfortable certainty of a dog who had decided this was where he was supposed to be. The door chimed again. A young man walked in, maybe 25, military haircut, the regulation fade of someone who hadn't quite stopped living by those rules yet. He was wearing a work jacket and carrying a helmet, and he was moving with a walk that Reed recognized, the particular careful gait of someone relearning their geometry, his left leg. He looked around the diner with the expression Reed knew, the expression of coming home to somewhere new and not yet knowing how to read it. The young man saw the dog first. Ghost had lifted his head. He looked at the young man with the dark, patient attention he gave to people he'd decided were worth knowing. The young man stopped. He looked at the dog. Something passed through his face, quick and private. He sat at the counter, 3 stools from Reed. Ghost got up from Reed's boots and walked to the young man and sat beside a stool. The young man's hand dropped automatically, found the top of the dog's head. The body memory of someone who had been around dogs and had that comfort available in the muscle before the mind caught up. Some of the tension went out of his shoulders. Reed picked up his coffee, turned on his stool. "First time in," he said. The young man looked over, took in Reed the way Reed had taken in every room for 40 years, efficiently reading what was there. His eyes went to the prosthetic, then away, then back, the trajectory of someone who understood the thing they were seeing. "Yeah," he said. "Coffee's good. Pie's better." Reed gestured at the case. "Blueberry if you haven't had pie in a while." The young man looked at the case. "Haven't had pie in a while," he said. "Then that's what you order." Nora came back to the counter. She looked at the young man, at Ghost still sitting beside him, at Reed. She poured without being asked. One for the young man, one for Reed. "I'm Nora," she said. "Marcus," the young man said. He had looked down at Ghost. "He know me or something?" "Ghost is a pretty good judge of character," Reed said. Marcus looked at Reed again, at the Iron Brotherhood patch on Reed's jacket. "You ride 40 years. I used to." He touched his left leg, a small unconscious gesture. "Before." "I ride with one," Reed said. Marcus looked at him, at the prosthetic. Reed could see him doing the arithmetic that everyone did when they saw it, the rapid recalculation of what was possible and what wasn't, the revision of assumptions. "How?" Marcus said. "Built a custom sidecar originally, learned to compensate the balance. It takes about 6 months to feel natural." Reed reached into his jacket. He had the cards there, the ones he'd had printed a year ago, when what he'd been doing on the road became something intentional, and intentional things needed names. He set the card on the counter between them. Ray's Legacy Garage, Iron Brotherhood MC, Veteran Motorcycle Restoration and Rider Training. Free for veterans. Marcus picked up the card. "Read it." "Ray," he said. "Who was Ray?" "My brother," Reed said. "Not by blood, by the things that matter more." Marcus turned the card over. There was nothing on the back. He set it down, looked at it. "He'd want you to have it," Reed said. "That's why his name is on it." Nora brought blueberry, a wide slice, the crust exactly as gold as it had looked in the case. Marcus looked at it, then at Reed. Something in his face was shifting the way faces shifted when they were deciding whether to let something in or keep it out. He picked up his fork. "Okay," he said. Ghost lay down across Marcus's boots. The young man looked down at the D. He didn't say anything. He just left his hand on the counter where Ghost could reach it if he wanted to. Reed finished his coffee. He looked at the wedge tags hanging from his jacket. Joe's tag and his own, worn smooth by 20 years of carrying. Two pieces of metal that had held 20 years of guilt and had become somewhere in the Nevada desert in the pre-dawn dark of a night that ended something else. Not guilt, direction. He thought about what it meant to still be here, to have been pushed out of the way of a fireball, and to have spent 2 decades wondering what to do with the life that implied. He thought he understood it better now than he had at 47 or 55 or 60. Not completely. Understanding was another thing that didn't complete itself. But better. You used it. You kept going. You picked up the thread when it needed picking up, and you followed it to the end, and then you looked around for the next one. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, Nevada area code. He read the text. "My name is Diane Foss, State AG Criminal Division. I have a situation in Elko County that needs someone who understands what I'm looking at. Merritt's network extended further than the mine. Can you come?" He read it twice. Then he looked at Nora. "I need to go," he said. She looked at him. "Elko," she said. "How did you—" "Because Diane Foss called me first to ask if I knew how to reach you." She smiled. "I gave her your number. I hope that's okay." "That's okay." He stood, set money on the counter, more than the coffee cost, because a diner needed to stay open and do what this one was doing, which was something useful. "Take care of Evelyn," he said. "Every morning," Nora said, "and she takes care of me." He looked at Marcus, who was most of the way through the blueberry pie and had the expression of someone who had not tasted something that good in a long time and was being reminded that good things existed. "The card has a number," Reed said. when you're ready." Marcus looked up. "What if I'm never ready?" "Then you call anyway, and we start from wherever you are." Marcus looked at the card. He put it in his jacket pocket. Reed went outside into the Nevada morning. The Harley sat where he left it, chrome in the sun. The sidecar, the custom rig that had been the answer to a problem he hadn't been willing to let stop him. Ghost hopped in. Reed swung his right leg over, set the left carefully in position, adjusted the balance, the geometry he'd been living inside for 17 years and had long since stopped thinking of as difficult. 3 taps on the carbon fiber. Tap, tap, tap. The ritual unchanged. The ritual that was not about loss anymore, or not only about loss. The ritual that was also about going. About the fact that going was still possible, that the road was still there, that the work was still there, that somewhere north of here in Elko County, there was something that needed looking at by someone who knew how to look. He turned the key. The engine caught that sound he had loved for 40 years, the sound of something large and mechanical, asserting itself against silence. Ghost leaned slightly into the turn. Reed pulled out of the gravel lot. He passed the sign at the edge of town on his way north. "Leaving Crestfall. Come back soon." He didn't look at it. He'd been in this town long enough. The road going north was new road, at least to him, at least today. The desert opened up ahead, red hills and blue sky and the endless possibility of a highway that went north without stopping. Ghost pressed his weight against Reed's back, warm and present. Tap, tap, tap. Still here, still moving, still keeping the promise he'd made to a man who had pushed him out of the way of a fireball and given him all the years that followed. Semper Fi, brother, Reed thought into the wind. Semper Fi. The Harley disappeared north into the Nevada morning chrome, catching the sun in brief, bright flashes like a signal from one thing to another, like something saying here and here and here, still going, still going, still going. And in Nora's diner in the corner booth, where you could see the door, a young man named Marcus sat with a dog sleeping across his boots and a business card in his jacket pocket, and a slice of blueberry pie that was inexplicably and entirely the best thing he'd eaten in 2 years. He didn't know yet what the card would mean. He would. The morning light came through the window and fell warm across the table, and the man who was beginning slowly to remember that he was still here. Still here was the beginning of everything. And somewhere north on a highway that went as far as you needed to go, Reed Calloway Road. Because that's what brothers did. Because that's what you did with the life someone gave you when they pushed you out of the way of the fire. You used it. Right up until you didn't have to anymore. Evelyn Strand arrived at the diner at 7 o'clock, as she did every morning, walking from her car with the careful deliberateness of an 81-year-old woman who had made peace with the speed at which she now moved. She wore a blue cardigan and the earrings Joe had given her for their 30th anniversary, small sapphires that she had never stopped wearing. She settled into her usual booth by the window. Nora brought coffee and sat across from her for the minutes before the morning rush began in earnest. And they talked, as they always did, about things that were not the trial or the mine or any of it. This morning, Evelyn had been thinking about teaching. "I taught 4th grade for 26 years, she said. "Do you know what I noticed? By October of every year, I could tell you which children were going to be okay and which ones weren't." She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug. "Not the smart ones. Intelligence had nothing to do with it. The ones who were going to be okay were the ones who, when something went wrong, turned toward people instead of away. That was the whole thing, that one small habit." Nora thought about this. "Turning toward instead of away," she said. "Yes, it sounds simple. It isn't." Outside the window, the Nevada morning moved at the pace of a Nevada morning, which was unhurried and large and indifferent in the particular way of wide spaces. A truck went past on Main Street. 2 women with strollers stood on the opposite sidewalk and talking. "Reed came by," Nora said. "I know. I saw the Harley in the lot when I drove past." Evelyn smiled. "And then I saw it wasn't there. He had to go to Elko." "Of course he did." Evelyn said it with the equanimity of someone who understood that certain people were made for arriving and leaving, and that what they left behind was not diminished by their leaving. He came. That's what mattered. They sat with the coffee and the morning light. In the corner booth, Marcus was on his second cup. Ghost had migrated from the floor to a position where the young man's hand could rest easily on his back, which it did without Marcus apparently thinking about it. He was looking out the window at the ordinary life of an ordinary small town on an ordinary morning. He had the look of someone who was learning to find ordinary things interesting again. That was a process. It took as long as it took. Nora would make sure he came back. Not because she had a plan for him, just because the diner was a place where coming back was easy, where the coffee was there before you asked, where a dog would sit with you while you figured out what you were working out. A woman came in with two children, maybe 7 and 9. The kids immediately spotted Ghost and made the sound children made when they spotted a large friendly dog, which was the same sound in every language and required no translation. Nora went to greet them, took their order, brought crayons from behind the counter that she kept there for exactly this purpose. She moved through the morning with the ease of someone who had found the thing they were supposed to be doing. Not every moment of it was easy. Some mornings her mother didn't know her. Some evenings she sat with the recording from the warehouse and listened to Merritt's voice for minutes at a time, processing something that she wasn't sure would ever be fully processed. Some nights Crestfall felt very small, and she wondered what it would have looked like to have gone somewhere else. But then morning came and the diner opened, and Evelyn was in her booth, and a young man with a new prosthetic was learning to eat blueberry pie in a corner, and Ghost was doing what Ghost did, which was knowing who needed him and going there. And Nora thought, this is the thing. This is what it's for. Not the resolution of everything that had been broken. Broken things didn't fully resolve. They healed, which was different, which meant they changed into something that could bear weight in a new way. The diner filled. The pie case began its slow depletion, blueberry going first. The coffee pot made its rounds. Ghost moved between the kitchen and the counter and the corner booth, knowing where to be with the certainty of something that had been built for this, for the simple, complicated work of being present with people who needed presence. The bell over the door chimed. A woman came in. 40-ish, dark hair, the particular expression of someone who had driven a long way and was deciding whether the destination had been worth it. She looked around the diner with the eyes of someone in assessment mode, cataloging. Her eyes found Evelyn in the corner booth. She stood very still. Evelyn looked up from her paper. The woman said, "Mrs. Strand." Evelyn's expression changed, just slightly, the shift of someone recognizing something she hadn't expected to see. "Lisa," Evelyn said. Lisa crossed the diner. She sat down across from Evelyn, the way you sat when you needed to sit and didn't have the words yet. Owen's fiancée. The woman who had moved away after he died back to wherever she was from. The woman Wade Culver had thought about in his small cell of regret during the months before he testified. Evelyn put her hand on Lisa's hand. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Nora brought coffee, set it down, moved away without a word. Outside, Crestfall went about its morning. The day's first truck went past on Main Street heading north. The sky was clear and very large. The hills north of town, where a mine now operated under federal oversight and produced what it produced and paid what it paid into the county and the people who worked it, those hills were quiet and brown and permanent in the way of things that outlasted individual human stories. Nora stood at the counter and watched Evelyn and Lisa talk. Watched the careful beginning of something being rebuilt from pieces. Watched the particular courage of two people who had both lost the same man and were trying to find what that meant now. She thought about Reed somewhere on a Nevada highway heading north. She thought about Joe Strand in a car 20 years ago, speaking to whatever future would eventually see him. She thought about what it meant to make something that lasted past you, past your fear, past the thing that was trying to stop it. Ghost shifted in his patch of sunlight, stretched, settled again. The blueberry pie was almost gone. She'd need to make another. Evelyn was laughing at something Lisa had said. A real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of a woman who had carried something very heavy and was resting from it. Nora went to the kitchen to start the next pie. She worked with flour and butter and the blueberries that came from the market on Tuesdays, and she followed the recipe Evelyn had written out for her on an index card in the careful script of someone who had spent 26 years writing things for children to understand. And she thought about how strange and ordinary it was that this was where everything had landed. A diner, a pie, a woman in her 80s laughing by the window. She thought about what Vernon had said the time he had stayed for 4 days sitting on the porch in the early mornings and walking the edges of town in the afternoons, and then on the fourth morning, telling Nora he decided the town was going to be okay. How can you tell, she'd asked. Places where people know each other's names, he'd said. Places where the diner is open at 6 and someone's always making pie. She put the pie in the oven, set the timer. She went back out to see if anyone needed more coffee. They did. They always did. She poured. In the corner booth, Marcus had taken out the business card. He was looking at it. He had been looking at it for 20 minutes, which was the kind of looking you did when you were deciding something. He took out his phone. His finger hovered over the number. Then he typed, "This is Marcus. You said to call when I'm ready. I don't know if I'm ready, but I'm calling anyway." He set the phone face down on the table. Ghost put his head in Marcus's lap. The morning held, and somewhere on a Nevada highway heading north toward whatever needed doing next, Reed Calloway rode with a team in 20 years of paid debt and a road ahead that showed no signs of ending. Tap, tap, tap. Still here, still going, still faithful. 6 months into Nora's ownership of the diner, she hired 2 more staff, a cook named Bernard, who had come from Reno looking for something quieter, and a high school student named Danny, who worked weekends and had the particular quality of someone who was going to leave Crestfall the first chance she got, which Nora approved of entirely. Going was as legitimate as staying. The point was that it was chosen. The diner had become, without anyone planning it, a kind of center, not a destination, not something you drove to from elsewhere. Just a place where the people who lived in Crestfall found themselves when they needed to be somewhere that felt solid. Evelyn was part of that. Her presence in the corner booth at 7 every morning, reading the newspaper and drinking coffee and being plainly 81 years old and intact, and there was a kind of statement about what persisting looked like. Luther Kane came through every couple of months, riding alone or sometimes with 1 or 2 of the others. He would sit at the counter for an hour, drink 3 cups of coffee, argue with Bernard about the correct way to make a Western omelet, and leave an amount of money that covered considerably more than what he'd consumed. He didn't explain this. It didn't need explaining. Vernon Hayes came once and stayed 4 days, which surprised everyone, including Vernon. He slept in the back room on a cot he'd brought in his saddlebag and spent his days sitting on the porch in the early morning and walking the edges of town in the afternoon, moving through Crestfall the way he moved through everything, with the patience of someone who found large amounts of time to be a gift rather than a problem. On the 4th morning, he told Nora he'd decided the town was going to be okay. She had asked how he could tell, and he had said what he said about people knowing each other's names and the diner being open at 6 and someone always making pie, and she had thought about it for a long time after. Otis Webb sent a postcard from somewhere in Wyoming. On the back, he had written in his minimal way, "Good job." That was the entire message. Nora put it on the board behind the counter next to the business license, and a photograph someone had taken of Ghost, sleeping in the middle of the diner floor, occupying the exact center of the checkered linoleum, with the confidence of a dog that had decided the middle of the floor was the appropriate place for a German Shepherd to be. Silas Montgomery sent Nora a card on the anniversary of the night at the mine. Inside, he had written, "Some things don't get to just be forgotten. Some things require someone to stand up and say it happened, and it mattered, and it's going to stop." He hadn't written where the words came from. She recognized them when she read them. She put that card on the board too. Marcus Hewitt came back. Not right away. 2 weeks after the morning he had called the number on Reed's card, he drove up to Flagstaff on a Tuesday, found the address of Ray's Legacy Garage in an industrial part of the city east of the highway, and stood in the parking lot for 5 minutes before going in. What he found there was a shop that smelled of motor oil and metal and had 3 motorcycles in various states of assembly and a wall covered in photographs of veterans with bikes they'd rebuilt or relearned to ride. Behind the counter, a man named Dale, who had one arm and the laugh of someone who had made peace with the universe. Reed was not there. Reed was in Elko. But Dale knew about Marcus because Reed had called ahead, and Dale walked him through the bikes and asked the right questions. And by the end of the afternoon, Marcus had a project, a 1987 Harley Sportster, with a frame that needed work and a reason to come back on Thursday. He came back. He came back the Thursday after that. He came back the Thursday after that. By October, he was riding again. Short distances at first, the parking lot and the street out front, finding the new geometry of balance. By November, he was on the highway. By the time the year turned, he was comfortable. Not the comfortable of before that was gone, and he knew better than to reach for it. The comfortable of after, which was different and in some ways more solid because it had been rebuilt rather than inherited. He sent Reed a message from a highway in New Mexico. Just on the road. Feels right. Reed sent back. Told you. Marcus sent, thanks. Reed sent, tell Joe's Garage when you get back. Not me, Joe's Garage. Marcus did not know who Joe was. He looked up Ray's Legacy Garage and found that the name had two parts. That Ray was for Joseph Strand, USMC Fallujah, 2006, and Legacy was for the thing that remained when a man chose a direction and other people kept going in it. He sent the garage a message, told them it felt right. Evelyn Strand, when Nora told her about Marcus, sat with her coffee for a moment. Then she said something that Nora carried for a long time after. Joe always said the point of anything good was that it kept going, Evelyn said. He said you didn't build things to last. You built them to propagate, to spread, to become part of what other things grew from. She set down the mug. He would have liked this. The garage with his name on it. The boy in New Mexico. She looked out the window. He would have said, that's how you actually win, not by beating the bad thing, by making sure the good thing outlasts it. Nora looked out the window too. The Nevada morning was doing what Nevada mornings did, spreading its particular light across the desert in a way that was different from anywhere else, flatter and wider and more honest somehow, the light of a place that had nothing to hide behind. Ghost was asleep in a square of sunlight on the diner floor. His paws moved slightly, running in his sleep, chasing something in the country of dog dreams. There was a day, 6 weeks after the verdict, when Nora drove up to Reno to see her mother and found Patricia in a chair by the window looking at the mountains. Her mother turned when Nora came in, and for just a moment, her eyes were clear. What the generalized warmth of someone who recognized a familiar presence but had lost the word for who it was. Clear. Present. The eyes of Patricia Sutton, who had taught earth science at a middle school in Nevada for 22 years, and had a daughter who became a geologist and came home when she was needed. Nora, her mother said, just that, just the name, just the certainty of it. They sat together for 2 hours. Patricia asked about the diner. Nora told her about Evelyn and the blueberry pie and the way Ghost moved through the room knowing who needed him. Her mother listened with the attention of someone who was working hard to hold the thread of it and doing so successfully, more successfully than she had in months. She asked questions. She remembered answers from earlier in the conversation and referenced them later. She was for those 2 hours completely herself. They didn't talk about what had happened at the mine or the trial or any of it. They talked about geology and pie and a balm and the way a diner felt in the morning when the light came through the windows at the right angle. They talked about things that were solid and ordinary and real. When Nora left, her mother was already drifting back to the place she spent most of her time. The clarity was receding. But her mother reached out and held Nora's hand at the door, and looked at her with eyes that were not entirely clear, but were not entirely lost either, and said, "I'm proud of you." Nora drove back to Crestfall with her hands very steady on the wheel and her vision not entirely clear, and Ghost asleep in the passenger seat beside her because she had brought him for the drive, and he had sat with Patricia for an hour the same way he sat with everyone who needed him, which was to say completely and without reservation and with the full weight of his attention. She opened the diner at 6 the next morning. Evelyn was in her booth at 7. The coffee was on, and the pie was made, and the door was unlocked, and the sign said, "Open in the window." And outside, the Nevada morning was doing what Nevada mornings did, and inside the diner was doing what the diner did, which was being the kind of place where people came when they needed to be somewhere that felt like something was right with the world, at least in this one small corner of it, at least this morning, at least for now. That was enough. It had always been enough. The door chimed. The first customer of the day came in. Nora looked up. She smiled. "Sit anywhere," she said. "Coffee'll be right there." And she poured, and the morning went on, and somewhere north on a highway that ran through the high Nevada desert toward whatever came next, a man and a dog rode into the kind of day that asked everything of you and gave it all back if you let it. Tap, tap, tap. Still here. Still going, still faithful, always faithful to the brothers who made it possible, and the road that made it matter, and the small necessary work of showing up when someone needed you to show up, which was the whole thing really, the whole long, simple, complicated thing. Reed Calloway rode north. The desert held him and let him go the way deserts did, the way distance always did with men who were meant to keep moving. The highway stretched ahead endless and true, and the engine ran, and Ghost rode easy, and the dog tags caught the morning light in 2 brief silver flashes and were gone around the next curve, and then the next, and then the next. After that, still going, still going, still going. The Elko situation took 3 weeks. It was quieter than Crestfall, less theatrical, more procedural, the kind of case that didn't generate the particular adrenaline of a countdown clock in a locked warehouse. Just the slow, methodical work of following money through accounts and comparing dates against records, and making sure the documentation was airtight before anyone moved. A former county assessor had been falsifying property valuations for 12 years, routing the difference through a network of real estate transactions that ended eventually at a set of retirement accounts held by 3 men who had all once worked for a federal contractor whose name Reed recognized from a case that Diane Foss mentioned in passing, a case in Utah that had been closed 4 years ago, but that she was now reconsidering. Merritt's network, it turned out, was wider than anyone had known. It had tendrils and connections and legacy relationships that had been established over decades and then left in place dormant, paying out modest amounts to quiet people who asked no questions and made no waves, and simply accepted that certain arrangements were part of how the world worked for people who knew the right things. Reed was not the one who unraveled it. He found the loose end. He handed it to Diane Foss, and she handed it to a team of federal accountants who had the kind of patience for spreadsheets that Reed did not possess and had never claimed to. His job was the same job it had always been: getting close enough to see what was actually there, get it out without leaving a mess, and pass what he found to people who could do something with it. He was in a motel outside Elko on the last night of the job when Nora called. Not a text, a call. Nora almost never called. She was a texter. The habits of her generation and her profession, clear and precise and to the point. He answered. "My mother had a good day today," she said. No preamble. "Tell me." She told him about the chair by the window and the mountains and the 2 hours of clarity. She told him what her mother had said when she was leaving. She brought him about the drive home and Ghost in the passenger seat and the diner the next morning, and Evelyn in her booth, in the way the light had come through the windows at 6 in the morning when she was opening up. Reed sat in the motel room with the phone against his ear and listened. Outside, the Nevada night was doing what Nevada nights did, which was being enormous and indifferent and somehow deeply comforting, the same quality the desert had in daylight. The quality of something that had been here for a very long time and would be here for a very long time after, and was not bothered by any of it. She said she was proud of you, he said when Nora finished. Yes, she's right. Reed. Yes. Do you think Joe knew when he made the video when he was sitting in that car, do you think he knew that it would eventually, that it would get here, to this? Reed thought about it honestly. I don't think he knew the specifics, he said. I think he knew that making the video was the right thing to do, and he trusted that right things, even when they failed in the short term, had a way of not disappearing entirely. They just waited for the right person to find them. Nora was quiet for a moment. Evelyn said something like that once, she said. Not in those words, but like that. She was married to Joe for 38 years. Some of it probably rubbed off. Nora laughed. A real one. The kind she'd been using more often lately. Reed had noticed the kind that didn't have anything careful behind it. Come back when you're done in Elko, she said. There'll be blueberry pie. That's worth coming back for. The pie or the other things? Both, he said. He hung up, sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Outside, Ghost was in the sidecar. Reed had taken the bike for the last leg into Elko because the Harley needed road time, and so did he, and the dog was asleep in the way he slept when he was not on duty, which was completely and with the absolute absence of self-consciousness that came from being an animal that had no opinion about whether sleeping was a dignified activity. Reed set the phone down, looked at the dog tags on the nightstand where he always put them when he slept. 2 pieces of worn silver in the lamplight. He thought about Joe again, as he often did at this hour in this kind of quiet. He thought about what it meant to make something and not live to see where it went. Joe had made the video not knowing that it would sit in a floorboard for 20 years before anyone watched it, not knowing that the woman he was trying to protect by making it would live to 81 and drink coffee every morning in a diner that served her dead husband's favorite pie. Not knowing that the man he'd pushed out of the way of a fireball would eventually come to Crestfall and do what needed doing and then keep going north toward the next thing. You made what you could make. You did what you could do. And then you trusted that right things had a way of finding their way forward even when you weren't there to push them. Reed lay down. Ghost adjusted in the sidecar outside some small dream movement of pause. The desert night held its enormous silence. Reed closed his eyes. In Crestfall, in a diner that stayed open at 6 because the people who needed it to be open at 6, a woman was already awake, already thinking about the morning. She would be at the diner before dawn to start the coffee and check the prep and make sure everything was ready when the first customer came through the door. She had learned to make blueberry pie from an 81-year-old woman who had made it for 38 years for a man who wasn't alive to eat it anymore. She made it now for everyone who came through the door. That was the thing about things that lasted. They found new hands to carry them. And in the morning, the door would chime, and the coffee would be ready, and Ghost would be there, and it would be enough. It would always be enough. There was a morning 2 months after the verdict when Reed came back through Crestfall, not because anyone had called him, but because the road between Flagstaff and the Idaho border ran through Crestfall County, and it seemed wasteful not to stop. He had told himself this was the reason. He suspected the actual reason was simpler, and he didn't examine it too carefully. He came in from the south again, the same way he'd come the first time. The same highway, the same hills, the same water tower, with the sun that had faded to a smear. But the smear had been repainted. Not perfectly. Whoever had done it had a better relationship with enthusiasm than with geometry, but the sun was visible again, orange and yellow, and slightly lopsided, occupying the water tower, with the cheerful imprecision of something that had decided being recognizable was more important than being accurate. He stopped at the water tower for a moment, engine idling. Ghost lifted his nose to the morning air. The town looked like a town. That was the thing he'd noticed the first time he came back, and was noticing again now, the cumulative effect of small changes that each seemed ordinary and unremarkable, but together added up to something that felt different from what he'd first ridden into. The empty storefronts were fewer. The church had not only repainted its steeple, but added a sign out front with one of those changeable letterboards that churches kept, and whoever was in charge of it had written, "Still here, still trying." Reed considered this for a moment and decided it was about the most honest thing he'd ever seen on a church sign. He pulled into the gravel lot. The Harley's engine cut off and the silence came back, the particular silence of a Nevada morning that was not absence of sound, but the sound of things that had been here before people arrived and would be here after wind and distance and the absolute patience of geography. Ghost hopped out, sat, looked at the diner door. Reed swung his leg over. 3 taps. Tap, tap, tap. He pushed through the door. The chime was the same chime. Nora looked up from behind the counter and smiled the way she smiled now, which was without the careful holding back that had been behind everything when he'd first sat at this counter and watched her pour his coffee with steady, professional hands and eyes that were full of things she wasn't showing anyone. "You didn't call," she said. "I was in the neighborhood. You were 400 miles out of your way." The road curves, she poured the coffee, set it at the end of counter, stool. He sat. Ghost went under the counter. Evelyn was in her booth. She raised her coffee cup at Reed without looking up from her paper. He nodded. Marcus Hewitt was at a corner table with a woman about his age, brown-haired, a coffee in front of her, and a notebook open beside it, and the particular focus of someone who was in the middle of explaining something important and wanted to get the explanation right. Marcus was listening with both hands wrapped around his cup and his full attention on her face and the kind of ease that people only had when they had been around someone long enough to stop performing for them. He caught Reed's eye across the room, lifted his chin. Reed returned it. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. "How's the bike?" Reed asked Nora. "Still running. Dale calls every couple of months to tell me how it's doing, which I find touching given that I don't actually ride it." "You should ride it. Probably maybe next spring." She leaned on the counter. "How's Elko?" "Handled. Diane Foss has good people. She called me, after, said to thank you." "She thanked me herself." "She said she wanted to thank you again through me. I think she wanted an excuse to tell me what you'd done without you knowing she was doing it." Nora looked at him steadily. "She said you spent 3 weeks on a case that most people would have handed off in 3 days because you wanted to make sure every connection in Merritt's network was documented properly so nothing could come back later. The case needed to be clean. That's what you told her. She said what she told me was that you were still there when everyone else had already moved on because you didn't feel like you were done yet." She paused. She said it was the most stubborn thing she'd ever seen that turned out to be exactly right. Reed drank his coffee. "The blueberry pie," he said. "Is there any—" Nora cut him a slice. It was the same as it had been the first time, the crust gold. The filling deep blue and honest, the recipe followed exactly as Evelyn had written it on an index card in her 4th-grade teacher's hand. Some things you didn't improvise, some things you learned, and then you did them exactly as you'd been taught and trusted that the rightness of them was already in the recipe, already in the making, already there before you started. Outside, the Nevada morning went on. A delivery truck pulled up to the hardware store across the street. A woman walked past with a dog, a small brown mutt who spotted Ghost through the diner window and stared for a long moment and then continued on satisfied with the information. 2 teenagers on bikes stopped at the corner and talked about something with the particular intensity that teenagers brought to everything, as if the conversation about nothing very important was actually the most important conversation happening anywhere. The diner filled around Reed as it filled every morning with the ordinary business of people who lived in a small town, starting their day in a place that made starting the day a little easier. Evelyn turned a page of her newspaper. Marcus said something that made the woman across from him laugh. Ghost shifted under the counter and pressed against Reed's feet. This was the thing that Joe had not known he was making 20 years ago in a car in the dark outside a warehouse. Speaking urgently to a camera, He couldn't be sure anyone would ever watch. He had been making evidence. He had been making testimony. He had been making insurance against his own death. But he had also, without knowing it, been making this morning, this diner, this woman behind the counter who had refused to sign a non-disclosure agreement and traced a shell company chain to a name and stood in a warehouse with a phone in her pocket and kept a dangerous man talking long enough for the right people to arrive. This dog sleeping across a one-legged man's feet. This young veteran in the corner learning slowly and not without difficulty that there was still something on the other side of what had happened to him. This 81-year-old woman reading the morning paper in the knowledge that the thing she had been afraid of for 20 years had finally been seen and named and stopped. Joe had made this the way anyone made anything that lasted, not by controlling where it went, but by doing the honest, necessary thing and then trusting it to find its own way forward. Reed finished his pie, set his fork down. He sat for a moment with the Choa tags in his hand, both of them the two pieces of worn silver that had spent 20 years being carried. They were lighter than they looked. They were heavier than any object that size should be. That was the nature of things that meant something beyond themselves. He set them back against his chest. "I should get moving," he said. Nora looked at him. "Idaho. There's a thing in Boise, man who reached out through the garage, needs someone to help him figure out what he's in the middle of." "That's vague." "It usually is at first." She refilled his coffee even though he'd said he was leaving. He drank it. The second cup of coffee in the morning was the one you had when you weren't ready to go yet, but knew you were going to, and drinking it was a way of saying both things at once. "Come back when you're done in Boise," she said. "I will. There'll be pie." "I know." He stood, put on his jacket. The Iron Brotherhood patch caught the morning light, worn and faded, and entirely itself. Ghost was already at the door. Reed walked past Evelyn's booth. She looked up from her paper and reached out and touched his arm. Once a brief pressure, the touch of someone who had run out of words for a thing and chosen the simpler language instead. He nodded. He went outside. The Harley sat in the gravel lot in the morning sun. Reed stood beside it for a moment, the way he stood sometimes, just long enough to remember what it was he was doing and why. Not long, a few seconds. Then he swung his leg over, found the balance settled. Ghost hopped into the sidecar and turned his face north. 3 taps on the carbon fiber. Tap, tap, tap. The engine caught. The sound rolled through the empty street and off the buildings and out into the desert in every direction, carrying everything and nothing the sound of going. Reed pulled out of the lot. He turned north on Main Street, past the church with its honest sign, past the gas station, with its new pumps, past the water tower, with its lopsided sun that had decided being recognizable was more important than being perfect. He passed the sign at the edge of town. Leaving Crestfall, come back soon. He would. The highway opened ahead of him, the same highway it had always been going north through the high desert toward whatever came next. Reed opened the throttle. The Harley surged forward and the wind came back and the dog tags caught the light one more time, and then they were around the first curve and the town was behind them and the desert was ahead of them, and there was nothing between where they were and where they were going but road. Good road. True road. The kind that went on as long as you needed it to. Still here. Still going. Semper Fi. Always faithful. To the dead who earned it. To the living who needed it. To the road that made it possible. To the simple, difficult, necessary work of showing up and staying until the job was done and then finding the next one. Reed Calloway rode north. The desert held him and let him go. That was how it always was. That was how it was supposed to be done.